So, picture this. It's a Champions League semi-final and there's 2 minutes left on the clock. If Barcelona score, they're in the final. If not, they get knocked out immediately. Only problem, they hadn't even gotten a single shot on target. But then, Iniesta scored. They had called him shy, discreet, humble, whatever. For years he had been overshadowed, overlooked. It shocked the world that that kid had scored that goal. The only one who wasn't shocked was Pep Guardiola, because he had seen that exact same thing happen 10 years before. On the 21st of July 1999, for once, the Barcelona players sat on the stands of the Camp Nou as their under-14s took over the pitch to play the final of the Club World Cup. It should have been a moment for the team to sit back and relax for an hour, but by the time the number 4 got a touch on the ball, Pep was sitting on the edge of his seat. A few minutes later, he told XAVI, "I know he will retire me one day, but I must tell you that kid will retire us both." Then, in injury time, with the game tied up, Iniesta scored. Minutes later, Guardiola himself had gotten down to the pitch to make sure he was the one to hand him the trophy, so he could deliver him a message. "In 10 years, I'll be watching you from the stands again." The only thing he got wrong was that instead, he would be watching him from the bench. Still, it shouldn't have come as a shock that the world found it so hard to believe that such an average-looking kid could be the next all-time great. I mean, Iniesta was born in a town that didn't even have a football pitch. There's an actual saying that goes, "At Albacete, you take a dump and you leave." And Iniesta isn't even from Albacete, he's from Fuente Albilla, which is literally 100 times smaller. The only reason Iniesta even managed to get into an academy was that his father had had his very own failed football career, never making it past the 3rd year. So he decided he'd do anything to make sure his son wouldn't have to live with that same regret. He went digging through his phone book, found the number of one of his old managers, Pedro Camacho, the brother of Jose Antonio Camacho, and got him a trial at Albacete. The day he finally got there were 200 kids fighting for a handful of spots, and still, 5 minutes later, they were already telling him to come off the pitch, telling him that they couldn't watch the other kids if none of them were even able to get the ball away from Iniesta. And that never changed. His family members would take turns driving him 40 miles to training 3 times a week, completely convinced that sooner or later his talent would be noticed, and once he turned 12, it happened. The team traveled to Madrid for the biggest tournament in the country, and against all odds, Iniesta carried little Albacete all the way to the semi-finals, beating Real Madrid in the process and taking the prize for best player in the tournament, a ticket to a theme park in Barcelona, which was oddly convenient since on that same tournament, they invited him to visit La Masia, which created a bit of a conflict of interests. Believe it or not, Iniesta had already told the reporters that he was Real Madrid through and through, and with the Camacho family involved, everyone was led to believe that he'd end up there, but their scouts kept insisting he was too small, and while they waited around for the kid to grow, Barcelona snatched him up, making him the youngest kid at La Masia. And if at that point it was already humiliating that Real had let him escape like that, it became a lot worse when only about a year after that famous moment with Guardiola, that tiny kid started training with the first team. Then, well, Real Madrid spent 7 years trying to undo that mistake. In fact, that same year they were almost successful. With the kid having just won the under-16 Euros, his father began negotiating his first contract, but Barcelona had just blown 35 million, making Saviola the most expensive teenager of all time, so they started lowballing everyone else, and it got bad enough that the father told them clear as day, "We're going to Madrid." Had the president himself, Joan Gaspar, not come down to straighten things up, who knows what could have happened. After all, a year later, once Iniesta doubled down, winning the under-19 Euros as well, Real got so desperate that Iniesta's father claims that he had to constantly ignore their calls, that at one point even Carlos Sainz, the 2-time world rally champion and a massive Madridista, kept calling him up trying to convince him to bring the kid to Madrid. It didn't work. Instead, the next year he got his debut, and by 2005, no player in the team had made more appearances than him. There was only one big Problem: 90% of those appearances were off the bench. It was becoming increasingly clear that Iniesta was seen as the kind of guy that only gets a start when someone else is injured, a second-grade player, and the next season that only became more frustrating. With XAVI blowing out his ACL, Iniesta completely took over the center of the pitch. As Barcelona's team rolled their way to the Champions League final, he was right there, playing every single minute and always a cut above the rest, and still, when the team sheet came out, he was on the bench. Even his teammates were shocked. For 45 minutes, he watched Barcelona succumb beneath a 10-man Arsenal. It was only after Eto'o approached the bench asking why Iniesta wasn't coming on that Rijkaard realized his mistake. And with 3 substitutions, he flipped the game on its head. Larsson assisted both, Belletti scored the winner, and yet, when he was asked about that game, he said, "We all know the story of Larsson and Belletti, but the person who killed us that day was Andrés Iniesta." But again, even though his performance was impressive enough that it got him called up to the World Cup despite having never played for the national team before, once back at Barcelona, he was back in the same old debate, either getting benched, fetching water for the superstars, or getting played out of position while the pundits kept yapping about how 2 fragile midfielders could never work together. And still, once Real Madrid made their final run for his signing, triggering his release clause, laying 60 million on the table and handing him a blank check, Iniesta said no, despite the fact that on top of all the struggles I already mentioned, he was one of the worst paid players in the squad. Thankfully, that scare served as a bit of an eye-opener for Barcelona. They renewed his contract, they made him a regular starter, but still, Rijkaard kept playing him on the wing. I mean, in a way, I get it. Every year Don Balón kept naming him as one of the best players in the league regardless. As they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even in the Euros, Aragonés did the same, and guess what? Despite playing half the tournament with a stomach flu, he still managed to put in a man-of-the-match performance in the semi-final, making it to the team of the tournament, as Spain finally won the Euros after 44 trophyless years. And still, the best thing that happened to him that year was that Pep Guardiola took over the team. When they asked him the fabled question, XAVI or Iniesta, he replied, "Both. Never one or the other. Together, always. People say they shouldn't ever be played together. I think they shouldn't ever be played apart." And so, it began. After a draw and a defeat in Guardiola's first 2 league matches, with sacking rumors already flying around, the ever-so-timid Iniesta entered his office and said to him, "Don't worry, keep doing what you're doing. I promise you, we are gonna destroy everyone." And from that moment on, Iniesta went undefeated, even though out of the 12 league matches he missed through injury, Barcelona only managed to win 6. They were a completely different team when he was on the pitch. El País had no choice but to name him the best in the country. They even nicknamed him Nureyev, because he rolled a pitch not by force, not by fear, but grace. Except for that infamous goal against Chelsea. That one was built on pure frustration, and it had far more than its fair share of consequences. His whole career, his whole life was at stake, all because of that one moment. Following that match, Iniesta began feeling a slight pinch on his right thigh, precisely the one he used to score that goal, and 4 days later, the medical staff ruled him out with his 4th muscle injury of the season. They made it quite clear to him that he either stayed away from the pitch or it could be the end of his playing days. But the moment he left the team behind, as it had been all season, Barcelona lost the 2 matches they had to play before the Champions League final. And with the treble at stake, Iniesta had a decision to make. And as he explained, "I knew right there that I would play regardless of the risk. There was nothing more on my mind. I wanted to win. I would have made that final even if both my legs were broken." But no matter what his state was, before the final, Sir Alex famously insisted, "I'm not obsessed with Messi. Iniesta is the real danger." And 10 minutes in, he had already assisted a goal that won them the trophy. At the post-match conference, Rooney called him the best player in the world, while Eto'o, who had already said that before, simply told the reporters, "I told you so." And when 9 months later the birth rates in Catalonia spiked 50%, they asked Guardiola was to blame, and he said, "Iniesta." But that was the glorious side to the story. The reality was that once the medical staff checked back on him after the match, they could immediately tell that he had made a massive mistake. And for the next 410 days, he would walk through hell trying to make it right. By September, Iniesta had spent 6 out of the last 10 months recovering from injuries, and it had taken a massive toll on him mentally. At the time, no one really knew about this except for one report that he was supposedly spotted crying inside the training grounds. But 8 years later, he revealed that during the early stages of recovery, he fell into depression, that he fell into a pit with no way out. His own mom was quoted saying that, something must be very wrong when your 26-year-old son shows up in the middle of the night asking you to hold him. And the worst part was that fate was extremely cruel. As Iniesta prepared to make it back from injury, Dani Jarque, captain of rivals Espanyol and ironically one of his best friends, a man that had won gold at the under-19 Euros alongside him, passed away suddenly from a heart attack, sending Iniesta into an even deeper hole. As he explained, the days following his death were awful. I felt like I was in freefall, like everything had gone dark. I told my family I wasn't sure where I would end up if things kept going at that rate, that I had to find help. And thankfully, a year later, no matter how many training sessions he had to leave early, how many times his injuries came back to haunt him, even though, as one article put it, he had lived a whole life in just 1 year. Once there, even after an injury scare forced him to leave the opening game and skip the second, Iniesta came back to secure the goal that put Spain in the knockouts, and 3 1-0 wins later, Spain found themselves in their first ever World Cup final. 3 hours before the match, Iniesta was being treated by one of the team's doctors and asked him, "Can you write something on a shirt for me? There's someone I want to dedicate my goal to." And 117 minutes into the match, in classic Iniesta fashion, he scored the most important goal in the history of Spain, winning his country their first ever World Cup. And as he ran to celebrate, he pulled his jersey up and revealed the message: "Dani Jarque, always with us." And so the next time he faced Espanyol, their fans gave their supposed rival a standing ovation. As one newspaper wrote, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event for a once-in-a-lifetime man. In one sweep of his foot, the quiet prince of Spanish football became king." But above all, what that goal gave him was the strength he needed to close out the darkest chapter of his life. 6 months later, he was second on the Ballon d'Or. 5% of the votes were all that separated him from Lionel Messi, and XAVI was the one completing the podium. And so, by the end of that season, when they faced United in a Champions League final again, they put up a performance so incredible, I could dare to call it perfect, at United's only shot on target not gone in. So traumatizing that according to XAVI and Abidal, Wayne Rooney himself asked them to slow down, hilariously telling them that we're already dead. It was absolute supremacy, so much so that almost a year later, Iniesta was still holding on to that same unbeaten run. By then, 38 matches in all competitions and eventually 55 consecutive league matches, spanning over 3 years, the longest in history. And if there were still any doubts that at his prime, Iniesta was virtually unbeatable, then came the 2012 Euros. Iniesta opened up the tournament with a man-of-the-match performance against Italy, and from then on, Spain did not concede a single goal for the rest of the tournament. Not necessarily because their defense was superhuman, but because for most of those 5 remaining matches, with Iniesta commanding his squad, the other teams barely got a hold of the ball. In the match against Ireland, he was involved in 2 out of the 4 goals. Against Croatia, he assisted the late winner. When they faced France, he started the play that led to their first goal. When Portugal forced him into penalties, he converted. And in the final, he took the Man of the Match award a 3rd time as they dismantled Italy 4-0. When the time to hand out the awards arrived, Iniesta wasn't just a player of the tournament. No, in an era dominated by Ronaldo and Messi, UEFA named him the best player in Europe. From that moment on, Iniesta just kept on stacking awards. By December, he made the Ballon d'Or podium again. By the end of the season, he won the World Playmaker of the Year award with 22 assists. The next year, he doubled down. By 2014, he was named the best midfielder in La Liga for the 4th year in a row. And with all that done, then Suarez arrived at the club, and the famous MSN trio led the squad towards the 2nd golden era. But just as they found themselves 1 match away from a treble, XAVI announced that he would finally leave the club at the end of the season. This was no surprise. He was already 35, Iniesta himself was 31, but that day, he decided he would make sure that the treble would be Xavi's parting gift, and so 4 minutes into the Champions League final, he had assisted Rakitic for the opener. And 74 minutes later, as Iniesta left the pitch as the only player in history to be named man of the match in a Euro, World Cup and Champions League final, Xavi came in his place, and for a split second, we witnessed the final time those two geniuses shared the pitch. For 3 years, Iniesta still managed to keep the troops at bay. Matter of fact, he still held on to his place on the Ballon d'Or list for 1 more year. He even managed to become the third Barcelona player in history to get a standing ovation at the Bernabeu, only Maradona, Ronaldinho and him. But every year, his injuries kept slowly robbing him of his powers, and by 2018, after going through 7 of them in a single season, Iniesta himself left the Camp Nou for good. But as much as his goodbye was glorious, there was no one there who could offer him the same kind of goodbye he gave Xavi. But still, his old friend made sure to write him a letter of goodbye, and somewhere in it, he told him, "Remember when they said we couldn't play together? Andrés, we surely proved him wrong."